Every other year seemed to be a bad year, but 1958 was a real bad year. Times were down in Detroit, and Ford had an ugly looking back end on their car. They had twin taillights that they thought that they looked good, but people wanted a big type light back there that looked like a fire coming out of an exhaust, like on an airplane or a jet, or it wasn't so much that, but anyway, people wanted to have a nicer car. So when in ~58 Chevy had a nice car, they came out with their rounded out Impalas and stuff like that. And so well, for I better go try to sell. But I didn't want to stay in Detroit, so that's when I headed for Flint, and I worked for Summerfield Chevrolet at that time. He was Postmaster General of the United States. So I worked there for a while, but it was a little bit hard. The guys had been on the job a long time, and so the work that I done didn't seem to work as well. And not only that, I didn't have quite the freedom that I did with Ford. Ford didn't care how you got the job done, but Chevy didn't like the idea of a would you take. So I started. Then I headed for New Orleans, and I got a job with Dumas Milner, and he sold pine. He invented pine sol products, but he was a Chevy dealer. And he owned several dealerships across the South, and in New Orleans, what he did for a parking lot, he had barges out in the Mississippi, and what he did is because he beat the freight was $100 in New Orleans and $25 in Chicago from the factory to ship a car to the dealer. So he had these barges, so he'd fill a barge full in Chicago, so he'd pay the short freight to Chicago, and then but not only had the barges to float the cars down on, and then he'd use those for parking lots. So he didn't have to have the expensive land. It was sitting out in the Mississippi River at a dock, and then they had big ramps going up to the barges that we could take customers. They'd have one brand on each one, like a Impala on one and pickups on one and so on. So the barges would be sitting right along the Mississippi, and we knew how to get it about a mile or so from the dealership. So that's where we had to take the customers, and it gave us a chance to talk to the customer and get him to know better, you a little bit better, and he'd feel a little more comfortable. And then going on that barge kind of was a little bit of something different, but that's what happened. So then I worked there for a while, and then I said, well, things weren't that as good around there for me, and I thought I wanted to get in a bigger dealership in a bigger town, so I headed for New Orleans, for Los Angeles. But I got in a dealership in Los Angeles, and what I really, it didn't fit because when I was in New Orleans, I had my buddy with me, and all night long he'd be putting out my handbills that I had with me, and so he'd sleep during the day, and I would have business the next day. So after about a day, I remember sitting in the sales room, and big long room there, looked like a fuselage on an airplane. And so a guy come by, a really southern accent. He was Creole, I guess. And he was walking back and forth because I'd sold 4 or 5 cars right away. So he come and he points a finger at me. I said, "Oh my gosh, you mad at me?" And then he pointed again. And he says, "There's a goddamn salesman." And so I said, "And I'm ready to leave town. I want to head. I got my car loaded out there." And so I'm going to kind of laugh a little bit. I was a little ignorant about it. So I remember getting in the car, leaving, looking back at the dealership and thinking, gosh, I could have probably done anything there. But anyway, I'm heading for Los Angeles because that's a big town like Detroit. And which was New Orleans, didn't have the vehicles. I'd go down to French Quarters there and put tags on cars too and talk to people when I could. But anyway, and so I got to Los Angeles, and I went in a dealership and with a Central type name on it. I don't know, Friendly Chevy or whatever it was, and So I go in and there's a pretty gal that greeted the people. They come in. All the salesmen stayed in the basement, and so she'd greet them, and then the next she'd get on the loudspeaker and so and so's name. She'd call your name, so you'd get the next person and the next and the next. It not only was fair, so a guy wasn't be hogging the ups as they called them, because they would be working harder on the one they got because they wasn't going to get another one. And so but that didn't work for me because I wanted to put out handbills. So I was down in that sales room for just a little while, maybe an hour or so, thinking it over what to do. And I said, well, I think this is not going to work for me. There's no way that I can do anything. I'm only going to have me about one up a day here some of the weekdays. So I got the heck out of there and I went to Nevada, the next stop, and I worked in a dealership there for a few days and made enough money to keep going. And I don't remember, I got back to Detroit again, see how things were around town. They were all bad because they still had 58 and full, and I wanted to sell Fords if I could, but I had to sell Chevys because they were prettier at that point.